Greetings, scholars, for our review on APUSH Unit 7, the Civil War and Reconstruction, looking at our review sheet class from top to bottom, the Confederacy and states' rights and the roots of the states' rights argument. Remember, the South subscribed to this idea of the compact theory, that the Union is a compact. It's an agreement between the states. And the Southern states seceded after the 1860 election. And if you look at the article which we did in class, the specific reasons why the South seceded, why the states left the Union, is protesting Lincoln and the Republican Party's platform of excluding slavery from the territories. Also, a complaint about northern states refusing to obey the Fugitive Slave Act, and a complaint about John Brown inflaming insurrection, or at least attempting to. There's a complaint about Negro voting, and it doesn't say where in the North, and also the provocations of abolitionists and abolitionism. Northern advantages during the war, basically every advantage with the exception of superior officers belongs to the North until about halfway through the war, at which point some better officers emerge in the Union Army, but the advantages would include the North has more states, more population, more industry, more weapons, more actual food grown to eat, more money, more banks, more ships, more trade, more immigrants, bigger army, bigger navy. If you can think of it, the North, the question is not so much why the North won, but how did the South hang on so long? Fort Sumter, in April of '61, South Carolina begins the war by opening fire on Fort Sumter, arguing that Fort Sumter, this Union federal fort, is on their sovereign territory. Lincoln tries to resupply it with food, but the ships and the fort come under attack. Major Anderson does surrender. And this is in the harbor of Charleston, South Carolina. The border states refer to those states that had slavery, but which did not join the Confederacy. And there are 4 of these slave states that remain in the Union. That's Missouri, Kentucky, Maryland, and Delaware. And Lincoln is going to treat these states with sort of kid gloves because he does not want to lose them too. Lincoln and civil rights. Lincoln is going to violate the right of habeas corpus, and this is basically the right to be charged if you're arrested and to have a fair trial, neither of which happened to several thousand, mostly Marylanders around. Remember, Washington, D.C. is surrounded by 2 slave states, one a Confederate state, Virginia, the other one Maryland, which is a sympathizing state, at least early on in the war. Now, Lincoln, he does allow a free election in 1864 in which he doesn't know if he's going to win this election. This is one of the things later, farther down on the review sheet. But Lincoln is going to get rid of Hannibal Hamlin, who was his vice president first term, and Lincoln is going to put the only Southern senator who did not join the Confederacy, and that's Andrew Johnson, who is a Southern Democrat. So Lincoln is, my personal sort of editorial comment is, Lincoln democracy is working fine with the exception of some habeas corpus violations immediately around the nation's capital. Of course, there are some other what are called copperheads who are arrested for rabble-rousing, so habeas corpus is violated. Emancipation Proclamation, keep in mind, the habeas corpus is violated in the South also by Jeff Davis, but that never makes it into the history books because they're the losers of the war. Lincoln and the Emancipation Proclamation. This is issued after the Battle of Antietam, which is also later down on the review sheet. Remember, at the Battle of Antietam, Lee will retreat after venturing into the North, trying to discourage the North, trying to get the North to throw in the towel. And this is considered by Lincoln to be a win. And now Lincoln has the confidence to issue the Emancipation Proclamation from a position of strength. And the significance for foreign affairs is this turns the war from a political argument between the North and the South into a moral crusade to end slavery. And remember, Great Britain ended slavery in 1833 in its colonies, and Great Britain runs a slave patrol off the coast of Africa, and if they catch you with slaves, it's capital crime. They'll hang you. So Britain is fiercely anti-slavery at this point, And as long as the war's not about slavery, England is, being very aristocratic, is on the side of the Southern aristocrats. But the significance here is this: it changes the trajectory of the war. It changes the reason for the war. It bumps England out as a possible source of alliance for the South. And in the Emancipation Proclamation, it allows black enlistment, and eventually black soldiers become about 10% of the Union Army. If you remember the movie Glory, if you've seen that, it's about that. Also, one thing you should know, and specifically, the Emancipation Proclamation does not free all the slaves in the United States. It only frees the slaves in areas of rebellion behind enemy lines. So it does not free the slaves in the 4 border states. It doesn't free the slaves in New Orleans, which is captured relatively early. The biggest city in the South still has slavery until the end of the war and the 13th Amendment being passed. Treatment of black soldiers by the Confederacy, real simple. If you're a black soldier, after they captured you, you were murdered or put into slavery. Immigration. Most immigration during the war, before the war, was to the north, and most during the war was to the north. And many immigrants, in particular Irish and Germans, will serve in the Union Army. Conscription is forced enlistment. It's another name for the draft. And in the South and in the North, if you're wealthy, you could buy yourselves out. If you had 20 or more slaves in the South, you didn't have to fight. If you paid a substitute $300 in the North, you didn't have to fight. And this is going to cause a riot, conscription, a riot in New York City of the poor Irish, who the riot's going to be directed against free blacks. And the poor Irish feel that this isn't their problem, and the free blacks are driving wages down, in a sense, from their perspective, taking food out of their families' mouths, and the free blacks are only increasing their poverty from the perspective of the poor Irish, and going off to fight and die for these blacks that are living in adjacent neighborhoods seems like an insult. Seems like they're being forced to fight for something that's not their problem, not their cause. The Trent Affair. This is early in the war. This is a ship between Cuba and Great Britain, which is stopped by the Union Navy, and two Confederate diplomats are taken off and are arrested, and Great Britain creates a diplomatic furor, crisis in England. There's threats of war against the United States, and Lincoln is going to diffuse this by letting these 2 Confederate diplomats go. And this is going to sort of end the tension here. But remember, England early on in the war is not sympathetic to the North. In fact, is more sympathetic to the South. They need Southern cotton. Something along the lines of 2 million Brits owe their jobs to this Southern cotton. And there's this phrase that cotton is king, King Cotton. And I think it's Mr. Hammond, Senator Hammond of South Carolina says, cotton is king, no one dares wage war against cotton. The South felt it had an indispensable crop. In fact, at the start of the war, the South is going to embargo cotton, is going to stop selling cotton to mostly to Britain, to try to force Britain's hand, which is a big mistake, because by the war's end, Britain is going to be replacing Southern cotton with cotton from places like India and Egypt. Southern economy during the war is going to be hammered. It is going to cotton export economy. You can't sell it because of the Union blockade. You certainly can't eat it, and the South doesn't have enough food, and the South doesn't have access to gold and silver from Western mines. So this Confederate dollar is going to basically be worth nothing at war's end. There again is this blockade, and the South doesn't have industry to make a lot of the things which are necessary for war. And in the meantime, the Union the economy is going to boom. It's going to thrive. Reason for Northern fighting early in the war. This is important, that the war initially is not to free the slaves. Even with the Emancipation Proclamation, the war is to free the slaves behind enemy lines, not all the slaves. So at the start of the war, why are Northerners fighting? They're fighting to preserve their country, to preserve the Union. And only after January 1, 1963 is there an added goal of ending slavery. And that's slavery behind enemy lines. The Monitor and the Merrimac are these 2 first ironclad ships that battle off the coast of Virginia, and the North will win this battle. Copperheads, this is the name of a Southern sympathizer for various reasons, or somebody who's sympathetic to stopping the war against the South. And some reasons for opposition to the Republican Party, opposition to Lincoln. Lincoln gets 55% of the vote in 1864, but 45% of Northerners are against Lincoln. So why would that be? Well, some oppose the Emancipation Proclamation. Some are racist. Some don't want blacks moving north. Some believe the war is being fought incompetently. And remember, Lee is this incredible general, and the North goes through a whole series of commanders that are basically incompetent. And the war is a bloodbath. I mean, we're talking hundreds of thousands of dying here, and the war is violating civil rights. And there are those who are not on the same page economically. They're not for an expansive, stronger government, which is producing paper money and jacking up taxes and raising tariffs and building railroads and things like that. So Copperheads are those who oppose Lincoln and who oppose the Civil War, at least towards the war's end. Sherman's March to the Sea in 64, it shows the South that the Union can move its army at will, and the goal here is to terrorize, to dishearten the South so that they'll throw in the towel, so that they will quit the war. In the election of 64, Lincoln is going to run against a former general of his, and that's George McClellan. McClellan is essentially running on a peace ticket, and the Republican Party sort of renames itself the Union Party. And again, Lincoln is not sure he's going to win this war. Now, while he's running towards the election, you're going to have two major victories, and that's going to be the fall of Vicksburg and the fall of Atlanta. And these are they're definitely going to help his prospects of winning, which he does. But remember, Andrew Johnson is the Southern Democrat who is he's a hardcore racist. He is going to be put on the ticket to win Democrat votes in the North. Treatment of blacks in the South after the Civil War. AP question that's been asked in the past is sort of what is the de jure, what is the legal position of blacks, and what is the reality, what is the de facto position of the freedmen. As far as politics go, as long as the Union Army is around, you do have African Americans, freed slaves, are voting, and they are serving in state offices, and they're being elected to the U.S. Congress. But after the Union Army goes, after 1877, there's going to be basically complete disenfranchisement. You're going to have terrorism by the Ku Klux Klan. You're going to have the imposition of literacy tests and poll taxes. And elections within the Democratic Party is essentially going to be considered to be a private club, that primary elections are not open to all citizens. So basically, black man's not going to vote once the Union troops pull down the flag and head north. As far as social treatment, you have what are called black codes. And black codes are meant to keep black Americans in their place. These are codes limiting, if you don't have a job, that's a crime. That's called vagrancy. You can't leave your place of work without permission, at least without paying your debts. And that was one way to keep workers in place. You had contracts that are being written by white landowners, and basically you signed, and if there's any arguments, well, you couldn't argue, and if you did, anything would be adjudicated by the owner or by a white court. Jim Crow is a little bit different. Jim Crow is social segregation. That's keeping blacks and whites apart in areas of social togetherness. This would be train cars, benches and train stations, bathrooms, drinking fountains, beaches, park benches, restaurants, buses, theaters, buses, of course, in the future. And so one is black codes are keeping blacks, available to work, keeping them from taking off. And Jim Crow is social segregation. As far as economics go, for the most part, the black slaves, freed slaves, do not get their own land. It means they have to work for cheap wages, and if there's not wages to be had, they're working for a share of the crop. And that crop, the crop goes first to the white guy who owns the land, and if you don't have money, you're borrowing over the course of the year. You're borrowing for your mule, for your tools, for food to get you by. And at the end of the year, you're paying back with debt, and guess what you owe? You can't leave. So in a sense, there's kind of a serfdom that takes place. Presidential versus congressional Reconstruction. You should know, generally speaking, congressional Reconstruction is harsh. They want the South to be, in a sense, to be punished. And Abraham Lincoln and Johnson, the presidential Reconstruction, is more lenient. There's that 10% rule under Lincoln and Johnson, and then you come back into the Union, a free and equal state. And the Congress wants an ironclad loyalty oath, and that's a majority oath of loyalty to the Constitution. The president's arguing that he's in charge of putting down rebellion, and that the states never left the Union. And the Congress is arguing, yes, the states left the Union, and they're in charge of territory. So these states committed sort of state suicide, and now Congress is in charge. What's going to happen is, under Johnson, Congress is going to override his vetoes and even take control of the Army, and Johnson is going to be probably considered to be the weakest president in American history. And do not get Andrew Johnson confused with Lyndon Johnson, who follows the assassination of Kennedy. Lyndon Johnson is one of the very strong presidents of the 20th century. So keep that in mind if you're ever talking about President Johnson. Military Reconstruction, often called Black Reconstruction or Radical Reconstruction, puts the South under martial law. This is after the lenient Reconstruction. The southern states are getting on board with this 10% business, and they're sending unreconstructed and unrepentant former Confederate generals and Confederate officials and those who violated their oath of allegiance to the United States. They're going back to Washington, D.C., and they're shut out of the Congress. And this radical Reconstruction is passed. And the South can't come in until they have passed the 14th Amendment, along with the 13th Amendment. Remember, the 14th is citizenship rights for the freedmen. Southerners who have fought in the war or who were leaders in the government are disenfranchised. And what's going to happen is, under radical Reconstruction, the people who are voting are the freedmen, handful of what are called scallywags. These are pro-union Southerners, and your carpetbaggers, these Northerners who come south for various reasons. Some might be for exploitation of Southerners who are sort of helpless politically, but some have, some are investors, some are do-gooders. But you have this government which by most Southerners is considered to be unrepresentative and essentially fraudulent by duress, by coercion. The Tenure of Office Act is a law that says that Johnson cannot fire any member of his cabinet without Congress's permission. Now, Johnson has inherited a bunch of Republicans, some of them radicals, who oppose him. Remember, he's Mr. Easy on the South guy, and the Congress is doing sort of this harsh rules against the South. And what Johnson is going to do is he's going to fire Secretary of War Edwin Stanton, who opposed Johnson. And Johnson is going to oppose a lot of things that Congress is passing. He is going to veto the Freedmen's Bureau, and the Freedmen's Bureau is going to be passed over his veto. Johnson is going to veto the 1866 Civil Rights Act, which is essentially the core of the later 14th Amendment. That's going to be overridden by Congress, and that veto is. And the 14th Amendment is going to be opposed actively. Johnson swings through the South on a speaking tour against ratifying the 14th Amendment. So these things alienate Johnson. He fires Stanton. There is a trial for to remove him from office. Keep in mind, impeachment does not mean to convict and kick out. Impeachment means to charge the president with crimes. And the House has this job. The House does impeach Johnson. Johnson is then tried. You need a 2/3 vote to kick him out, but he is not kicked out. He's not convicted. He is saved by 1 vote. So he comes real close to getting the heave-ho. The Civil Rights Act of 1866 basically gives black Americans full civil rights, and it disenfranchises for the former Confederates, which is the core of the 14th Amendment. The Civil Rights Amendments, there's a Schlesinger video some of you have seen out there, which talks about these as the Equal Rights Amendments. And that's kind of confusing because there's an Equal Rights Amendment giving women equal rights, not the right to vote, but by sex. And that is going to fail under Jimmy Carter. So I wouldn't use the phrase Equal Rights Amendment or amendments. I would use Civil Rights Amendment. And the 13th Amendment ends slavery. The 14th Amendment gives full citizenship rights. Remember, this is the one, this is being filmed right now in November of 2018. Trump says he's going to executive order the end of birth citizenship for people who sneak over and have their babies in the United States. But the 14th Amendment specifically says if you're born here, you are a citizen. And the courts have ruled that way to support the plain meaning, which of course is being subverted by those who come over for what's called birth tourism, or those who are sneaking in. But that's sort of a current event, hot issue now with the Trump administration. But if you're born here, you have the full civil rights of an American citizen, referring to slaves who had been born here. And the 15th Amendment is going to give not just civil rights, not just legal rights, but the right to vote. And the 15th Amendment says that you can vote, that the African Americans who are freed can vote. Now keep in mind, this is still African American men. Women will not get the right to vote in the United States until the 19th Amendment, which I believe is in 1920. So that's coming down the road. So there's your quick review. Signing out.